Because that's exactly what these predators had figured out. Not through research papers. Not through human-designed models. But through instinct sharpened over generations. The coyotes weren't trying to overpower the hogs. They were outthinking them. And that changed everything. For decades, the narrative around feral hogs had been simple. They were too strong, too aggressive, too numerous. A biological force that had spiraled beyond control. Entire ecosystems bent under their pressure. Crops destroyed. Soil overturned. Native species displaced. But what if the real story wasn't about strength at all? What if it was about timing? Because what those infrared cameras captured wasn't just a hunt, it was a pattern. A repeatable, deliberate strategy aimed at the only vulnerable point in an otherwise unstoppable system. The beginning of life. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The footage showed coyotes returning night after night, not randomly, but with purpose. They tracked farrowing sites, the hidden nests where sows gave birth. They learned the terrain. They anticipated movement. And most importantly, they waited. Why wait? Why not attack immediately? Because patience, in this case, was more powerful than force. A full-grown feral hog is dangerous. Razor-sharp tusks. Thick hide. Explosive aggression. Even experienced hunters approach with caution. But a newborn piglet? Defenseless. And that's where the balance shifts. The intelligence we ignored. For years, coyotes had been labeled as opportunistic scavengers. Survivors, yes, but not strategic hunters capable of influencing large populations. That assumption may have been one of the biggest mistakes in modern wildlife management. Because what the cameras revealed was something far more complex. Communication. Coordination. Division of roles. One coyote would distract. Another would circle. A third would strike. This wasn't chaos. This was planning. Now consider this. How long had this been happening without us noticing? How many nights had played out exactly like this, far from human eyes, while we focused on traps and helicopters and statistics? And more importantly, how many solutions have we overlooked simply because they didn't fit our expectations? Nature's silent correction. There's a concept in ecology that often gets ignored in modern intervention strategies. Balance doesn't come from elimination. It comes from pressure. For every species that grows too fast, something else eventually rises to meet it. Not to wipe it out, but to keep it in check. A correction. Not a war. And that's what makes this discovery so unsettling. Because it suggests that while humans were fighting feral hogs directly, nature may have already been working on a solution. Quietly. Efficiently. Patiently. But here's the twist. In many regions, coyotes themselves have been heavily hunted, trapped, and removed. Seen as threats to livestock. As nuisances. As problems to be solved. So ask yourself, what happens when you remove the one species that might be slowing another? The answer is already visible. Exploding hog populations. Fields destroyed faster than ever. Control methods failing at increasing rates. Could it be that in trying to fix one problem, we amplified another? A system on the edge. The implications of this aren't small. They ripple outward. If coyotes are significantly impacting piglet survival rates, then their presence isn't just incidental, it's critical. They're not just part of the ecosystem. They're a regulating force. Remove them and the system tips. Support them, and something unexpected might happen. Stability. But stability doesn't look like control. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because human systems are built around dominance. Around direct action. Around visible results. Traps filled. Numbers reduced. Immediate outcomes. But nature doesn't operate on short-term wins. It operates on long-term equilibrium. And sometimes, that means letting processes unfold that we don't fully understand. So the question becomes, are we willing to step back? Or are we too committed to fighting a battle we were never meant to win alone? The resistance to change. Even as this evidence emerges, not everyone agrees. Some argue that coyotes alone can't control feral hog populations, and they're right. On their own, They probably can't. But what if control was never about a single solution? What if it's about layers? Predation, habitat management, strategic human intervention. A system, not a tactic. Because the truth is, no single method has worked so far. Not trapping. Not aerial hunting. Not fencing. Each one addresses a piece of the problem, but never the whole. So why expect a different result by repeating the same strategies? Why not ask a different question entirely? What if the goal isn't eradication, but balance? The future we didn't expect. Imagine a system where feral hog populations don't explode uncontrollably. Not because they're being hunted relentlessly, but because fewer of them survive to adulthood. Fewer births reaching maturity. Fewer exponential spikes. A slow, steady pressure that changes the trajectory of the entire population. That's what the cameras hinted at. Not a dramatic solution, but a quiet one. And quiet solutions are often the hardest to accept. Because they don't feel powerful. They don't feel immediate. But they work. Over time. So now we're left with a final, unsettling thought. What if the real answer to one of America's most destructive invasive species has been happening in the dark all along? Unnoticed. Unmeasured. And in some cases, actively prevented. For years, the battle against feral hogs has looked like a war humans were destined to lose. These animals tear through farmland, destroy wetlands, rip up pastureland, and leave behind damage so brutal that entire communities have learned to dread the sound of rooting in the distance. Farmers wake before sunrise to check fences that have already been broken. Ranchers scan fields that looked untouched the night before, only to find them churned into mud and ruin by morning. In many places, the problem has become so severe that it feels less like wildlife management and more like an ongoing disaster. And yet, while people argued over traps, helicopters, bait, poison, fencing, and budgets, something else was happening in the shadows. Something quiet. Something natural. Something most people never thought to notice. Because while humans were focused on the hogs they could see, another predator was targeting the problem at its most vulnerable point. Not the adults. Not the ones that were already tearing up fields. But the future. The next generation. The source of the explosion itself. And that changes everything, doesn't it? The question that changes everything. This story is not only about feral hogs. It is about how we think about control. It is about how we define success. And it is about the dangerous habit humans have of assuming that the loudest solution is always the best one. We are taught to believe that if a problem is big enough, our answer must be bigger. More money. More equipment. More manpower. More force. But what happens when the most effective strategy is not the one that looks impressive on paper? What happens when the real answer is already operating all around us, using methods so simple and so ancient that we dismiss them as impossible? Could the most powerful solution be the one that requires no announcement at all? Could nature, in its own patient and relentless way, already know what we are still trying to learn? That is the uncomfortable question at the center of this story. Because sometimes the answer is not to fight harder. Sometimes the answer is to understand deeper. And once you begin to see that, the entire story changes. A strategy hidden in plain sight. For decades, the human response to feral hogs focused on what was visible. The adults. The damage. The immediate threat. It made sense in the way most emergency responses make sense. You see destruction, so you remove the destroyer. You see a problem, so you target the thing causing the most obvious harm. But nature does not always follow the same logic humans do. Coyotes, for example, were not interested in the same fight. They were not standing there trying to match humans trap for trap, helicopter for helicopter, dollar for dollar. They were not reacting to the visible mess in the field. They were behaving according to instinct, opportunity, and survival. And in many cases, that meant they were reaching for the most vulnerable part of the hog population, the piglets. That single detail changes the entire meaning of control. Because population management is not just about how many animals exist today. It is about how many will exist tomorrow. And tomorrow is where humans often fail. We see one problem and attack it in the moment, while the true system underneath keeps moving. But coyotes, whether anyone intended it or not, were applying pressure at the root. By reducing survival at the earliest stage, they were doing something humans spent millions trying to do with machines and manpower, slowing the cycle before it could explode. Is that not the part we usually miss? Do we spend too much time fighting the visible symptom and too little time looking for the invisible cause? The silent shift. As the years passed, evidence began to pile up in ways that could no longer be ignored. Reports from different regions started to show the same pattern again and again. Where coyotes were active, hog reproduction was disrupted. Piglet remains were found in predator scat and stomach content analysis. Population declines appeared in certain areas where natural predation pressure remained strong. And in places with fewer coyotes, the opposite happened. Hog numbers rose. Damage spread. The problem deepened. No helicopters. No traplines. No expensive operation. No public announcement. Just a quiet adjustment in the ecosystem. That is what makes the story so powerful. Not because it is dramatic in the human sense, but because it is ordinary in the natural sense. Nature did not need a headline to begin restoring balance. It did not need permission. It did not need a grant proposal. It simply continued doing what predators have always done, applying pressure where the population was most fragile. And once you realize that, a new question emerges. If the most effective work was happening without us, why did we assume we were the only ones capable of doing it? Why do we so often treat nature as something to override instead of something to understand? The mistake that made it worse. Then came the part of the story that turns frustration into regret. At the very same time coyotes were helping suppress hog populations in certain regions, humans were working to remove coyotes themselves. Bounty programs encouraged the killing of predators. Thousands were taken out. And what followed was exactly the kind of consequence that should make anyone pause. In some places, hog populations surged. In one area, they tripled. The pressure that had once been quietly limiting the spread was gone, and the invasive species responded exactly as any living population would when resistance disappears. It expanded. It reproduced. It overran more land. Think about that for a moment. We removed the very force that was holding the line, then acted shocked when the line collapsed. How many times have we done that in history? How often do we identify something as a nuisance because it is inconvenient, only to discover later that it was performing a role we never understood? That is the tragedy here. Not simply that the hogs were destructive, but that our attempt to simplify the problem may have made it worse. By seeing coyotes only as pests, we ignored their function. By pursuing a short-term fix, we disrupted a longer-term balance. And the most painful part is that the ecosystem had already begun offering an answer. We just were not paying attention. A new way of thinking. Eventually, the strategy had to evolve. It did not happen all at once. Real change rarely does. But slowly, and often after enough damage has been done, the thinking began to shift. People started to recognize that fighting an invasive species was not just about destruction. It was about coordination. It was about studying movement patterns, reproduction cycles, seasonal behavior, and predator presence. It was about combining tools instead of relying on a single one. Smarter traps were introduced. Timing improved. Coverage expanded. But perhaps the most important change was not mechanical at all. It was mental. The conversation began to move away from how do we eliminate everything, and toward how do we work with the system already in place. That meant acknowledging the role of natural predators rather than treating them like obstacles. It meant recognizing that in some cases, removing coyotes could weaken the very resistance that helped keep hog numbers from spiraling out of control. It meant understanding that not every wild animal is either hero or villain. Sometimes an organism is part of a larger chain, and breaking that chain has consequences. Isn't that the lesson so many of our biggest failures keep trying to teach us? That ecosystems are not simple. That balance is not an accident. That interference can be more damaging than restraint. The bigger lesson. So what did that original footage really reveal? Not just a hunting pattern. Not just a surprising interaction between two species. It revealed something much larger, a reminder that nature operates on a scale and timeline humans often struggle to match. Every night, beneath the darkness, beneath the stillness, beneath the invisible glow of infrared cameras, the system continues. Animals hunt. Predators patrol. Young are born. Some survive. Some do not. And through that cycle, pressures are applied, populations shift, and balance is negotiated again and again. We like to imagine that progress always means more technology, more funding, more control. But what if some of the oldest systems on Earth still outperform our most expensive strategies? What if survival itself is already full of intelligence we have not learned to respect? That is why this story matters. Because it is not really about one invasive species and one predator. It is about humility. It is about realizing that the world is not waiting for us to invent every answer. Sometimes the answer is already there, hidden in plain sight, operating quietly while we argue over what to do next. And once you see that, you start to ask different questions. Not just, how do we stop this? But, what is already stopping it? Not just, what can we remove? But, what happens if we remove the thing that is actually helping? Not just, how do we win? But, what does winning even look like if we do not understand the system? The final question. So now, let me ask you this. If the most effective solution to a billion-dollar problem was never technology, never funding, never human intervention, but something we spent years trying to eliminate, what does that say about the way we think? What else are we getting wrong? How many other answers are already out there, quietly doing their work while we overlook them? How many times have we called something a threat, only to later discover it was part of the defense? And how many solutions are waiting right in front of us, unseen only because we have trained ourselves to look in the wrong direction? That is the real lesson hidden inside this story. Not that coyotes are perfect. Not that nature is always kind. Not that every problem can solve itself. But that sometimes the most powerful forces are the ones we do not appreciate until they are gone. And once they disappear, the real cost becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine the scene for a moment, a wide stretch of open land on the edge of a growing city, where neighborhoods push farther into once wild spaces, and every year the line between civilization and nature grows thinner. It looks peaceful from the road. But behind that calm surface, a struggle is unfolding. Laws are being debated. Money is being spent. Experts are being consulted. People are demanding action. Something is out of balance, and everyone wants a fix. But what if the answer was already moving through the darkness each night? What if the very animals people feared were the ones quietly keeping the system intact? Coyotes are not usually described as heroes. They are not praised in headlines. They are often blamed, hunted, or treated like unwanted intruders. They appear in the wrong place at the wrong time, and suddenly they become the villain in someone else's story. But have we ever stopped to ask what role they were playing before we pushed them aside? Have we ever considered what happens when the natural order loses one of its guardians? Because that is where the real twist lies. When the coyotes were there, something important was happening. They were controlling populations, restoring balance, and preventing a much larger collapse. They were doing work no machine could easily replicate and no government program could fully replace. Yet because their labor was invisible, it was taken for granted. And because it was taken for granted, it was dismissed. Then, when they were removed, the consequences arrived slowly at first, and then all at once. The problem grew. Costs rose. The damage spread. And suddenly, the expensive solutions people had trusted began to look weak, incomplete, and far too late. Isn't that how so many of our biggest mistakes begin? We confuse presence with inconvenience. We confuse function with nuisance. We assume that if something is wild, untamed, or difficult to control, it must also be useless. But what if that instinct is exactly what keeps us blind? That is what makes this story so powerful. It is not just about coyotes. It is about the human habit of removing what we do not understand, then spending years trying to fix the emptiness left behind. It is about the arrogance of believing that every answer must come from us. It is about forgetting that nature has been solving problems long before we ever arrived. And maybe that is why this lesson matters so much now. In a world obsessed with faster systems, bigger budgets, and more advanced tools, we rarely pause long enough to ask a simpler question. What is already working? Because sometimes the breakthrough is not invention. Sometimes it is recognition. Sometimes it is humility. Sometimes it is finally admitting that the solution was never missing. It was just ignored. So the next time we face a problem that feels impossible to solve, maybe the first question should not be, what can we build? Maybe it should be, what is already working? Because sometimes the biggest breakthroughs do not come from new ideas at all. They come from finally understanding what was there all along.